Okay, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for attending this amazing event. My name is Arnaud Gifreu, and first of all, I would like to thank Stefano Odorico, Dr. Stefano Odorico, and University of Bremen for inviting us and having organized this amazing event. My talk is entitled Interactive Documentary as a Tool for Research. And basically, I will divide my presentation in two parts. The first part, I will explain how I divided my research, how I structure my research, because I conceived as a transmedia strategy, doing my PhD research on interactive documentary. And the second part that I will explain is about a set of case studies I will to share with you, in which I was involved in terms of applying interactive documentary as a tool for research, trying to convince you that this could be a good tool for research. I have no doubt about that. So first of all, I will share you three basic ideas. The first of them is this one. If you work eventually, or you have worked in communication studies, cultural studies in general, there are three big key areas: production, training, and research, and sub-areas like, for example, if you work in research, you can do some kind of diffusion and dissemination of your work through, for example, articles or blogs. If you produce, you can organize, for example, events, festivals, workshops, like Stefano did. If you do some kind of lecturing or training, you can do some kind of management for your company, university, etc. Some of the people here, I'm sure, that are working more than in one field of this, more or less. You are merging sometime production and training, or researching and training. So to me, it was very important in my research trying to merge all these three areas, which is very complicated, but in the end, I think that you can take benefit from all of them. So this is my first idea. The second idea here is like, I thought, okay, if interactive documentary could spread to different platforms, for example, like cinema, websites, virtual reality, etc., and the same goes for the transmedia documentary, and the transmedia narrative as well, why not we could spread research on several platforms as well in order to reach a wider audience. So this was my hypothesis when I was starting my PhD in 2007 in Barcelona, in Pompeu Fabra University, and then basically I just did my best in order to make connections, in order to create this structure possible. It was very complicated as well, but in the end I will show you how from my research and doctoral thesis I made some kind of these areas, a big area of confluence. In terms of research, for example, I became in 2011 a contributing editor and collaborator of IDOCS, for example, with a conference with Judith, Sandra, and Mandy, and with the Open Documentary Lab. In dissemination, I run two blogs, for example, Interdoc. I will show you briefly now, if I am able to do online. Interdoc is a well-known place for Latin American interactive documentary believers, let's say this way. And I run a blog as well from Spanish TV called WebDocs, Stories from the 21st Century. In terms of production, for example, I work on a project, a very ambitious project called Coming Doc. I will give you 5 cents after about this project as a case study, and organize the interactive and transmedia activities from Docs Barcelona. And basically as training or lecturing at the SCAC, the University of Barcelona, and ERAM, where I do management as well, because we have a very interesting structure. I want to share in 2 minutes with you, because I think which is kind of interesting. So I will show you briefly these two parts. This is the website I told you before. This is the website. It's quite difficult because I have to do this, but I will do my best. So here you have, for example, Interdoc, this kind of research place. The first resource in Spanish written. There's only 2 resources in Spanish. It's a pity, but should be more, but eventually we'll do it. Basically, we do articles, we create some structure of kind of group of researchers as well. And the other thing I'm very proud of is in University of Girona. In University of Girona, we have this school of audiovisual and multimedia. And what we have is we create in the showroom, you can see all of these projects in English. Of course, it's in Spanish and Catalan. But what we create is basically we work on a structure which is defined by 8 students combined with 8 mentors. Each mentor is a specialist in one area, I mean post-production, script, coding, design, etc. And in 4 months we create basically non-fiction, fiction, and company transmedia projects. So in the end, we gather groups of 15, 20 people working for 5 months in a very tight schedule to produce, and in the last 4 years we have produced more than 21 final degree transmedia projects with this scheme in Girona, which I'm very proud because I'm the coordinator and the transmedia tutor of these projects, and we have won several awards, for example in the European Youth Award in Austria or the Interactive Digital Stories track in Madeira Film Institute with the MITI, the Madeira Interactive Technologies Institute, for example. So this is some of the things in which you can work if you are doing some kind of research of like that. So this is another idea of fusioning these key areas. And basically, if we go to look for some ideas or some projects, if we just have a look to the early days of narrative expression forms, we see how, for example, through paintings, sculpture, written books, even photography, all took from earlier research. So if even before this, or even after in the 19th, 20th century, with the optical toys, with the cinematograph, kinetoscope from Edison, for example, even in fiction and non-fiction, with movies from Lumiere's, for example, etc. Before and after, there's a research. Even in the inventions, before the inventions, there's a huge research to get to this point in the inventions. And I want to focus my second part of my presentation in projects, in case studies. In this sense, I think that a very relevant form of expression of documentaries is the form of the meta-documentary. The form of the meta-documentary is a documentary that talks about documentaries itself. There's a good and interesting framework of what, although it's a virgin space of basically of research, I will just list few of them, and I will just talk briefly about this idea, because to me it's very important about the relation between interactive documentary and research. Of course, we have to start with this project. All of you know about that, The Man with the Movie Camera from Zigaberto from 1929. And it's very interesting because it's not about the past, this project, because in a poll, in a very important poll that the British Film Institute and the Sight and Sound documentary, Sight and Sound magazine, from United Kingdom, in where Judith and myself were invited, we voted for the, let's say, the greatest documentaries of all time. That's a very interesting point, and you can imagine, you can guess which is the best documentary ever by most critics. The Man with the Movie Camera. No? So more or less, I think that that's all set, that a documentary and a meta-documentary, because at that point was a real moment of course, exhibition and research about that, creating a documentary. If we go on the digital realm, we can find other works, for example, Capturing Reality, The Art of Documentary, from Pepita Ferrari, from the National Film Board of Canada, very nice film about linear documentarians, the big ones like Werner Herzog, Errol Morris, etc. It's a big resource done from the big one, the National Film Board of Canada. If we go in the academic realm, we can find, for example, this experimental webdoc, WhatsApp webdoc, from students from Université Paul Valéry Montpellier 3 in France. It's about the French webdoc, focus on the French webdoc basically. And another big and nice project created from Atalanti Dionysius, The Journey of Documentary, 2014, Australia, while she was doing her master's degree and PhD on interactive documentary. She created a very well-crafted web series about the evolution of documentaries, has won several awards as well. And more recent developments, I really like very much this project, Biology of a Story, from Canada again, one of the big producers in the field, from Anna Buchwilder and Ilios Design Labs. Of course, Mike Robbins is behind. It's like very, very beautiful crafted, this project. It's not about the documentary itself, but the story, how we generate and how we create basically the stories. This is more or less, there's more, but to me these are the more relevant meta-documentaries, and all of them, just the base is research, and I will just finish my presentation with some case studies and conclusions. In relation to case studies in which I was involved, that's the particular thing here in case studies, I will show you, I want to share with you MetaMental Doc is our experimental thing in Spain. It's in Spanish, I'm sorry, or maybe you can understand, but what we work here in the students from the University of Vic, my previous university, was create some kind of platform in which basically you can navigate. Here you have the website. So the students use in different grades this kind of as a second virtual campus. There's a game, there's a forum, there's the projects, written projects, like it's a meta documentary. They elaborate and explain how to create a documentary. There's a feature documentary of 50 minutes of the best documentaries according to the student research. And there's an interactive documentary. This interactive documentary has a lot of parts. You can split the feature documentary. You have some kind of interviews as well with the major experts in Spain that you can interview, and you can do a playlist, and then you can consult afterwards your playlist. You have basically virtual room with more than 300 documents, all quoted and downloadable in Spanish, free of rights, of course, and all the festivals around the world. And you have a historical background with Spanish documentarians and documentarians around the world. So we have more or less, we gather here more than 150 documentarians. So I think this is a valuable, really valuable resource about documentary. And it's another way to study documentary. Not maybe you don't want to read, you don't like to read. You have this platform and you can consult, and you can even make marks and quotes using this interface. So this is our approach, and we took 3 years to develop with the students these platforms with the laboratory from the University of Vic. So this was the first case study. The second one is Coming Doc. Coming Doc is an attempt to translate my PhD, my research, into something practical for people who want to study online, creating a transmedia meta documentary. But I will show you a video. If you agree, I will show you a little video, and I think that it's more understandable in 2 minutes what is Coming Doc. Just it's here. Okay, here we go. So these are my hypotheses from my research, which I try to answer in my PhD, and then I translated into basic questions, and I interviewed 60 experts, to me, the experts in the field from the period 2012 to 2016, and then from these 60 experts, I create several other parts. For example, we have a documentary series that each month is uploaded to Open Documentary Lab, for example. You have a web platform as well, more educational. So you have videos, for example, about the story of the interactive documentary. This is all available online for free. I mean, it's just... Okay. And in this way of making research and using the platform of interactive documentary, in more like for mainstream or for TV. We create from Televisió de Catalunya, from Catalan Autonomous Television, some kind of interactives. Televisió de Catalunya, in Catalonia we have a telethon, which is 24 hours long, in December for diseases each year. So we create, it's a big, huge transmedia project composed by the telethon program of the TV, CDs, books, etc., but as well training in school. So these interactive things. The first one was about cancer diseases. It was very simple. The second one was about, maybe the best one was this. We use the metaphor of the labyrinth in terms of neurodegenerative diseases. And here we use the metaphor of the labyrinth for the cells, for the neurons, for the synapses. And we create this interface. It was very gamified and immersive at that point. So all of these projects, and the last one was about the heart diseases. We create a game and some kind of questions. In the end, you have to get your diploma. So the idea of that, before we worked 6 months with doctors making research, making medical research in order to be able to make some competent interactive projects. So to me, it's very interesting to show you these projects. And the last project I want to show you is Cyber Project. This is about a man who has a disease. He's not able to see colors, only he's able to see in black and white. And we create this transmedia documentary. We create several platforms, we create different things. And well, you can see, for example, here a summary of the project. And basically, we research a lot with Neil Harbison, who is the main character of this project, who is this guy who used some kind of eye on his head in order to translate nouns. He translates basically this device, translate notes into colors, more or less. It's quite complicated stage. You have to go through the project if you want to find out the truth. But the good thing here is that we did a lot of research with him in order to create some kind of platforms that could translate into people what is not perceiving colors in life. So we developed, like you see, a feature documentary, a transmedia documentary, few apps. It was a long project. It was 3 or 4 years of developing. So I think that is another example of how you can use kind of research and then apply and try to reach an audience using basically storytelling and using what the most interest to me, which is basically transmedia storytelling. You can see and you can access all these projects online. And now I will finish my presentation with the conclusion, which is this one. I think that we can use transmedia narrative as a way to disseminate our research using several things, for example, words, like articles or blogs, organizing events, festivals, congresses, etc., and above all, with images, creating audiovisual, interactive, and transmedia works. Each area uses different strategies, but the good thing is to reach wide audiences is that the researchers should merge some of them. Basically, I think that transmedia narrative could be applied to research basically in 2 directions, either during the research period itself. Imagine that qualitative and quantitative data could be used, for example, using surveys, focus groups, user tests, and this can be understood as multiple platforms. Why not? Taking this data and transforming and allowing the user to understand this data, understanding as multiple platforms. And basically, the second one is to explain or represent the research results using basically fiction and non-fiction interactive genres. As I said in my I demonstrated in my first part of this presentation. And then you can use, for example, in terms of journalism, visualization of data, diagrams, infographics, reportage, multimedia specials, documentaries. The people talks widely here, so I'm not going inside, basically, or more experimental like film or reading essays, educational formats, or applications for museums. That could be very useful to use in order to expand or spread your research. So basically, doing that, you can engage, to my opinion, and make people understand your research, which normally uses technical words, and it's quite complicated to understand in terms of a very boring written paper or PhD or whatever. With all respect, but you can use these strategies that transmedia narrative offers to you in order to expand your story or create your narrative. And basically, my final idea is that imagine that you are doing a PhD or a research and you are going through different stages, and in every stage you make connections you talk to people, you go to conference, you attend workshops, and then you can unify, you can create a unity within these connections, and in the end, basically, the day you defend your PhD or whatever in front of an audience or jury, you can, it's a performance, more or less, like today, and you can defend and you can show a central piece, but then some kind of satellites, some kind of expanded things that could make people easier to understand what you are doing. This was my idea 10 years ago. I did not make everything I wanted, but some of them, yeah, I wanted to share with you my part of my life. And okay, where am I exactly? I'm trying to, my postdoctoral focus research is about interactive and transmedia nonfiction, and trying to map this new area in which we are living maybe the second, third, or fourth VR revolution, who knows? But my idea is trying to focus this virgin and unexplored place called interactive and transmedia nonfiction. Thank you very much.
So, fantastic, as usual, I would say. So I attended so far several of your presentations, but I'm always impressed about how prolific you are. I mean, the amount of projects that you presented today is just incredible. Just one comment, like very brief about. I mean, there is a lot, obviously, of content, but what is really interesting is how you. I mean, it's great how you translate, all what you do into research in iDocs, but also how you use research applied to your teaching, which is quite key on all the projects you presented today. So that's something really interesting we'd like to explore further later, the idea of teaching as a practice. So let's see if there's any questions. Question? Yeah, Nick?
Well, actually impressed by how prolific you are. I was just wondering, in your experience of making so many transmedia iDocs sort of projects, apart from student projects, how you found it in terms of funding them? Is it the broadcasters, or is it cultural institutions, and what are they looking for? Because in your last project, the Cyborg project, it did look as though it was perhaps a complement to a documentary, and I was wondering if this was how you saw the funding situation.
The funding situation is quite critical, especially in Spain and Latin American countries. The first project I've shown you were auto-financed. I mean, for example, Coming Dog, and were experiments which I was very lucky to do in my universities, University of Vic, University of Girona, because I was in charge of the multimedia production final degree projects. So it was easy to me to create with the students, not for my ideas, but them, but as using as case studies for my research, as MetaMental Doc is a clear example of creating a platform. But I will say in one sentence, since I was 35, all my projects were auto-financed, and I was ruined about that. And then some broadcasters in Spain started to say, okay, let's create some kind of cyber project or whatever. So it's very difficult in Spain to create this kind of stories in terms of funding. It's very experimental. I think in the world, more or less, besides maybe Canada and France, the same situation. And I was in Prague, in the ISTOP platform. I was very lucky there in March. And I talked with people from Canada, from France, about, who whispers me about the situation in the world, about the interactive documentary. And there's maybe, it's good, but there's bad news as well, because it seems that the formula could be basically the 3 platforms nowadays for big broadcasters. Let's say the feature documentary, long documentary form, short forms like video clips, like short movies, like etc. Because this works with young people. They are competing against YouTube, for example, and finally immersion, VR, 360, whatever. So it seems that this formula is what they are financing so far. So where is interactive documentary here? It's here, I think. It's in education, it's in research, it's in social activism, it's in other fields, but maybe it will never be a mainstream, because for broadcasters it's very complicated to produce, and I think that it's a problem that Stefano in the book, I think it's very relevant, about digital preservation, digital heritage. Because if Flash doesn't work, what does it mean? Half of the interactive docs don't work anymore. So I think that's a huge thing. I need to think about that and to reflect, and today in the roundtable we can go further.
Thank you very much. With a question? A question over there? No? Sorry. Just so Julie.
I was just going to say for me, my hope is that the short form, we can kind of subvert that and take the short form back into all this interactive work we've been doing. So at my university, actually what I'm doing now, my teaching now on the course where I've grown iDocs, now it's the short form that's taken over from the multi-platform transmedia interactive documentary. So it's very real, and I think we have to take the short form. So as soon as you've got the short form, if you've got many short forms, you need an interface, and then maybe we can bring it back in.
Web series, for example, making some kind of little interaction and trying to mix or unify this kind of web series could be a formula.
Yeah.
We have to reinvent again.
Exactly. I think
But
we've
I
got to
think
subvert
that-
it and reclaim it.
Yeah, because
Okay, thank you very much. Floor is all yours.
Thank you, Stefano, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak today. I'm going to talk about a few of those projects. Pretty much since 2012, I've been interested in interactivity. My background is, my background initially is as a traditional, as it were, academic. I did a doctorate that involved a sustained period of fieldwork, which led me into making documentary films, so I started undertaking lens-based practice. But there are limitations, really, to being a documentary filmmaker as a director, especially a self-shooter. And there's certain projects that I always felt were bigger than any one filmmaker could really take on. And one of the projects that Stefano mentioned there was called The New Ten Commandments, where I decided to make a film about human rights in Scotland. But I decided there was no one particular perspective from that I could take on. So I got 10 different directors to pick a human right each and to look at it in terms of how Scotland might consider it. So the right not to be enslaved, the right to asylum, etc. And we created a portmanteau, so a feature documentary, effectively with 10 chapters. And the BBC funded it, as well as our local sort of film agency. But I was kind of frustrated on the back of that in a way, and I still had this sort of question about how you deal with bigger questions that are often academic questions, research questions. And so if you take a topic like Scottish identity, how do you make a film about something like that? So I'd had this sort of notion running in my mind, and then when and I have a sort of producer side to me, which somebody mentioned about being a bit schizophrenic this morning, but I sort of think when there are opportunities as a producer, your ideas can come into being, hence my very real question to Arno before about where the funding comes from. And 2012 was, in the UK, the London Olympics. And this meant a lot of money from the arts sector was pulled away from the arts sector and put into what was called the Cultural Olympiad, which meant in Scotland, we didn't call it that because we're Scottish, we called it the Year of Creative Scotland. But it was still Olympic money. And the London Olympics is in itself a sort of a mass media exercise. And they had the Olympic torch that would come through the whole of the UK, but it also happened to be the same year of the Queen's Jubilee, her 60th anniversary of her ascension to the throne. So in terms of a media context in the UK, there was an awful lot about Team GB, Team Great Britain, about the Queen, about the Union. And of course in Scotland, this was had a slightly different context. The independence referendum had already been given a date to happen in September 2014. And there was a real sense, real questions, pregnant questions within Scotland about Scottish identity and its place within the world, let alone within the Union. Questions that weren't yet put into a political discourse. In that sense, what I mean is the political parties were not allowed to campaign as yet. The campaign could only run 9 months prior to the referendum itself. So whilst these questions were there, they were there within the culture, but they were there in a way that was in some ways sort of not fully expressed, articulated. So I wanted to ask a question about how to represent a nation and a people at this particular time, at this particular moment. And this, so I would say this was in a context of what I would call identity politics. And this is sort of some of the representations and to this day, if you pick up a paper like the Daily Telegraph and there's an article on the independence referendum, you are more than likely to see one of these kinds of images, We are the barbarians in the north, as far as they're concerned. And this is identity politics. And of course, the Scottish people are far more complicated and sophisticated than these images might give you thought. Now that might seem kind of obvious, but nonetheless there's the question of how to do that. So I even versed away from the word Scotland, because I felt that was, in itself, was a sort of difficult thing. And I came up with a project called Northern Lights. And this was effectively to create a crowdsourced documentary. So to put the question back to the people themselves and say, okay, you get the opportunity to represent yourself. What can you do here? So this pushed me towards a web-based infrastructure and interface. So this was new territory for me. So it meant I wasn't employing a cinematographer, I wasn't employing a location sound recordist. I was looking for a completely different team, very much social media people. I was working with designers. This is the page that sort of sits now, that flipped into the distribution stage. But prior to this, it was a wee bit more like this. It's based on a YouTube API that we were lucky in our time was created as part of the Arab Spring. What that basically meant was YouTube created something for citizen journalism that allowed people to upload footage, but it wouldn't go live straight away. There was a moderating process. So somebody somewhere else could effectively check that the footage was okay, could check it factually, could tag it, could even edit it, and then they would put it upline. So it's not a direct posting. And we needed that level of moderation. Otherwise, we could have lots of Scottish barbarians posting pictures of their naked bums or something. So we were really kind of fortunate, because we were thinking, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do this? And then YouTube put it out there as an act of goodness to the Arab Spring. And so effectively, we began what was a 3-month campaign to get people engaged. And so we used a number of methods to sort of do this, one of them being cash incentives. But they had a 3-month period within which to submit footage to our site. It could be any format. It could be shot on their mobile phone, their DSLR, whatever, on their iPad, whatever. They just had to upload it. And they also had to, they could vote on the other submissions that were already there. And there was an audience award, and the audience award also was a kind of cash prize. And they could look, we'd encourage people, of course, to look at other submissions. We would push out those submissions on Facebook and Twitter. We were really super active on all those platforms. And we effectively rolled out what was very much an online and digital strategy. We had blogs, 3 blogs a week. I brought in a number of cultural figures to be the judges for the particular submissions that we were giving awards to, who were well known, who in themselves had big Twitter and Facebook followings. We created how-to videos that were sort of mocking in some ways of the BBC approach. We made them with comedians, and we were trying to lower the threshold on any barrier to entry, because a lot of let's see, Britain in a Day was a project that was just about to come out before this, and it was very BBC and reverential, and it was about social history, and it was important to tell us stories about your past. And we were perfectly conscious that in Scotland there's a kind of, they don't really like middle-class English people telling them that their history is important. And so we had to pitch it in a different kind of way. So I'm going to show you how our first sort of viral trailer that we pushed out, which will give you an idea of where we sort of located our project. warned you about the naked bottoms. So we give people 3 months, and this it says thanks to the Scottish YouTube community. There was no such community at that point that called itself the Scottish YouTube community. But there was after we sort of generated it. And we started that conversation with people in Scotland who were already posting things to YouTube, their own kind of material. But in complement to this, and this is, I think, one of the important aspects that I'll return to at the very end as well, about online and offline. We had this whole other offline strategy, which was a workshop model. And we ran, in the end, 55 workshops throughout the whole of Scotland, 35 two-day sessions. We worked with media access groups across the whole of the country. But we targeted residents in deprived areas, people with disabilities, women, residents of rural areas, young people, older people, minority ethnic groups, all the groups who traditionally do not get involved in large-scale media projects and large-scale cultural projects. So those who, the digital literati who are already online, who are already big in Facebook and Twitter, whilst we were pushing things at them, they weren't the ones that we delivered the workshops to. So not only would we deliver the workshops to them, but we would leave them with flip cameras. And we would leave them without, so they didn't even have to upload anything to us. They just had to shoot things on their flip cameras, put it in an envelope, send it back to us, and we would download it and then send the camera back to them if they wanted to shoot even more. So we made it as easy as possible. And the target regions, they're just the 5 main regions of Scotland. So one of the main currencies for a documentary filmmaker, I think, is trust. And the main way you establish trust is through your own presence and your own interactions, and usually spending prolonged periods of time with the subjects of your films until you gain that trust, until you feel it's a time to pick up the camera, and what people are going to do in front of the camera you recognise as being authentic. But with a crowdsourced project where the major interface is the internet, is web-based, you don't have necessarily that means of credibility. Now, I did a number of calls to action and I fronted the project, but I went out and did 20 of these sorts of workshops. I met people as much as possible, and the workshops also became another mechanism to let people know that whilst we were looking for material and footage, we weren't looking to exploit them. We weren't looking to make fun of them. We were wanting, if they found something funny, we were hoping to laugh with them, not at them. And so the offline was absolutely vital, because then we would encourage the people in the workshops to also go online and share things that had happened at the workshop, put it up on the website, and their experience of attending one of these workshops. So absolutely vital. The response at the end of the 3-month period was good. We got 70,000 visitors over the 3-month period. Weekly visits 4,000. A lot of action on Facebook and Twitter. More to the point, we got over 1,500 video submissions, which resulted in over 300 hours of footage, which we then spent the next 6 months editing into a 98-minute feature documentary. So the project worked in that regard, but before we even got to making a film, the feedback from the participants, from the process, was hugely heartening. And at this point, to be honest, in terms of the funders as well, this is what they cared about. It was all about mass participation. It was all about inclusivity. It was all about digital connectivity. So we had a lot of people who said some of those things about representation, that they didn't feel represented, and this gave them a platform. They didn't necessarily have to be filmmakers. It wasn't that we were trying to create a nation of filmmakers, but we were trying to get people to think of documenting moments that were important to them. And if they would share those moments, or even those people that were important to them with us, then we would create something from that, and that should be recognisable to other people as they navigated the web interface. But then the project flipped to what in some sense is a more traditional sort of form. The film went out into cinemas. We had a premiere at the Glasgow Film Festival. But we had something that was unique in this regard. We had a built-in audience. Because of our 70,000 people who had got involved in the 4-month period, the 3-month period, the cinemas became interested. And so we managed to get into Cineworld, which is a big cinema chain in the UK and into the biggest one in Scotland. And we managed to let them give us a go. We were the first feature documentary ever to be distributed by Cineworld in Scotland. We released on the same day as Star Trek and Iron Man 2.
you might think that's a disaster. And admittedly, at the time, I thought it wasn't so good either. But we became a David and Goliath story. It was like, do you want to see what Hollywood has done with 150 million? Or do you want to see what your neighbours, your mates, your friends have done with their little video phones that we've put together and turned into a film? And the brilliant thing about Cineworld is they play your trailer before Star Trek and Iron Man 2. So everyone that's gone to that film anyway sees our trailer and they know it's on. So we did amazingly well, because they're not very romantic in Cineworld. If you don't get the numbers, the bums on seats, you're out within a couple of days. But we had a great opening weekend, and we in fact stayed on for 3 weeks. And we ended up playing in over 200 cinema screens across Scotland. We went out with the Screen Machine, which is a mobile cinema that we take around the Highlands and Islands. We've had school screenings. We got nominated for a BAFTA. So it was great. But the final part of it really was we became part of a conversation that was going on at that point about national identity. We made it more difficult to slip into those sort of stereotypical identity politics, identifications of what it means to be Scottish. Identity, and it's already been used to lose in Guattari's notion of assemblage, became a number of things. The film dealt with a number of themes. Anyone who watched it could see clearly the land was a big issue. Health was an issue, gender, ethnicity, inequality, employment. Humour was a massive element of it. The Scots were a wee bit like the Jews in that regard. We can make fun of our own performances of identity, we just don't like other people doing it. And it was aspirational. There were political and cultural imaginaries, at work, clearly visible. People articulating the kind of Scotland they would like to see, but in non-party political language, because we managed to catch it at this moment just before the discourse had taken root. But ultimately, it wasn't analytical. It was experiential. It was a 98-minute journey that kind of flowed. It was affective. People did cry. People also talked quite a lot. Now, normally as a filmmaker, that would annoy me, being in a cinema where people are talking through my film. But there was this great sense of recognition. People say, is that place? We didn't put names on anywhere. Is that place up the road? Is that over there? I know somebody like, isn't that so-and-so's cousin? And there was a really great collective sense of ownership around the film. And of course, as anyone knows in the film business, what that leads to is word of mouth, which is the strongest currency in distribution to this day, which is what led us on to being in the cinema for nearly a year in Scotland. So I had that experience whilst I was actually at the University of Edinburgh, and that was my practice-based research, and it became the impact case study for the school, actually for the College of Humanities for Edinburgh as part of the REF. You just have to be British to know about the REF. But what's important in some sense for maybe somebody here is the university at that point really valued such a project. They suddenly saw the value in it because the participation, the level of impact, we could track the Facebook engagement, the Twitter engagement, we could tell how many people went to the cinema and what places, we even knew what kind of background they came from. We were mining data all the time. So we could give that qualitative data in terms of people's feedback because we got evaluations at every one of those 55 workshops, but we could also give the data as well. So it was a humdinger of a case study and they liked that. But for me, what I also realised was that there was more at this point to what a sort of online interface could offer. So that, for me, that online interface, and it's questionable whether it's an IDOC in some sorts of ways, it was a mechanism, that's why I put the word infrastructure there. It was an infrastructure in many ways to generate footage for a feature documentary. We created a community out of that. It was extremely active for about 4 months, but in many ways it was still a mechanism for traditional output, which was one that went out in the cinemas. But when I came to UWS, University of the West of Scotland, which is a multi-campus university, which means it's partly in Glasgow, in Paisley, in Hamilton, and in Ayr. I wanted to try something different with those students. And one of the things I realised with the students in Ayr, which to be honest I think is the same with students kind of everywhere, is they always think life is happening elsewhere. So Ayr, you've probably never even heard of it, is about 40 minutes away from Glasgow. So the students in Ayr think life is happening in Glasgow. And the students in Glasgow think life is happening in London. And the students in London think life is happening in Paris. The students in Paris think it's happening in New York. The students in New York think it's happening in Berlin. You know, life is always happening kind of elsewhere. And I realised with them what they hadn't quite understood was it doesn't really matter where you are. It is one of the great things about the web, and we'd kind of proved it with Northern Lights, that it does give you this immediate possibility to publish. But what we didn't pursue in Northern Lights that I wanted to pursue now was, what does that mean in terms of the form? What should the form be? So what does this possibility of the web offer up in terms of form? So I kind of posed a challenge to the students. I said, okay, I've managed to raise money for 3 projects. I want you to come up with projects in your locality. Okay, so it's not a project in Glasgow or New York or anywhere else. It's right here in Ayr. And how can we explore your locality through this digital web-based interface? So I called it a digital space and a sort of third space. I call it a third space because I think it's a space within the university, but it's also got this aspect where you publish, where you're live, but we also got creative practitioners, industry professionals to come in and engage with us. But it was a kind of even footing because it was a co-creation, co-production process. Because none of us knew what the output was quite going to be. It wasn't going to be a traditional documentary. Then there was always this question. The conversations were always open in that regard. Who's got the best idea about what a web-based project might be? So the first issue, when we think about them, of digital issues, was they wanted to explore a nuclear power station that sits about an hour away from where the university is in Ayr. It was a good question. It was like the question became, what does it mean to live with nuclear power? And we called it the 2.4 km project. It became called the 2.4 because we discovered in the research that the people that live within 2.4 kilometres of the power base get these potassium iodate tablets. That if there's a nuclear accident, they have to take these tablets. And the people that live maybe just one step outside don't. And this effectively creates the radius for us to investigate, to conduct really a sort of media ethnography within that 2.4 kilometres, to speak to the people that live there, that work there, that pass through it. So there's some farms there, there's some dog kennels, there's a nuclear police operation, and of course there's the people that work in the plant themselves. And then we came up with what we thought was a useful way of exploring it for the web. And again, this wasn't for computers, this is for tablets really, and for sort of iPhones, so it's for swiping, it's that form of navigation, because this is what the students themselves said that that's how they consume most of their media. So we organised it in 3 principles: visible, invisible, and hidden. Visible are things that you can see, obviously like the nuclear power plant itself. Invisible are things like radiation, and hidden are the things that you're not allowed to see, such as things inside the plant. But again, it was something new in terms of its form. You would navigate in a different way, and it got the students, opened up the way they started to think about how they could explore and investigate their environment. And it was multimedia. We brought together students from different disciplines. So some of them were filmmakers, some of them were radio students, some of them were photographers. That's me. And that was our first sort of issue. And the second issue was what we called the river issue. There's a big river that flows right by the campus. And when we asked the students about it, they knew nothing about the river, really. All they knew was that it was outside the window. So then we thought, okay, how do we explore the river? What might be an interesting way to do it? And we thought it might be interesting to do a sonic and an audio exploration, to listen to the river. Again, it's a sort of simple process, but it changes the way students think about things. If you say, go and listen to the river, you think you sound slightly barmy, but then we say, okay, let's go and find the source. So it became an exploration right from the source of the river, which ended up being 40 miles away from our campus, all the way down, we're on the coast, to the port of the sea. And we effectively created little audio-visual pieces that are location sound recordings. But they're creative location sound recordings. And they got to use hydrophones, and they got to use different types of microphones to create this. And this is one that's really meant to be heard with headphones, on your phone, maybe going for a stroll was the sort of instructions we kind of gave it. But again, you know, a different sort of web-based form, a different way for them to explore, and of course to document it with photography as well. And this then takes me to the final edition of UWS.io, Interactive Online. The other thing on the Ayr campus, on the other side of their campus, is the Ayr Racecourse, which is a big racetrack. And of course, none of the students had been in there, or at least none of them would admit to me they'd been in there. And so there was a question about how would you explore something like that? And there was something about maybe it was just the circularity of the track, or maybe it's just the fact that VR and 360 are starting to become a sort of issue, but we decided we'd make a 360 film about the Ayr racecourse. This is the team. But 360, in terms of its production, creates all sorts of challenges. For me, it's a bit like shooting in film in the old days. You put the camera down, you don't know what you're going to get because you can't figure it out until you bring it home and put it in the computer and it's all weaved together. So you've got to really try and figure out where you're going to place the camera. Because we did it as documentary and it's not choreographed, a lot of the VR films that you're seeing that you can call themselves documentary are actually highly choreographed. But we were at a racetrack, which made that quite difficult. But there were some positives about being at the racetrack. Everyone that goes to a racetrack effectively signs a disclaimer about being on film, because the races get filmed by people like Channel 4. So it was actually quite a good place once you'd navigated. It was a bit of classic documentary producer navigation to get access. But once you get access, you can film wherever you like. And for a documentary director, there is this problem about interactivity. Interactivity means people might not look where you want them to look. So in this particular instance, this couple in the film, this is at the very end of the race, and the ideal experience would be that you would watch the horses come down here, and then once you've watched them cross the finishing line, you would continue to turn around, and these two kiss. They have a wee snog, I think maybe because their horse came in. And that's a lovely little sequence, a lovely little cut, no breaks in it. But what if you don't look there? You miss the whole thing. What if you just decide to look somewhere else in the crowd? And so then of course, and you mentioned it earlier, the work of audio comes in. How can we create other acoustic prompts that could allow us to bring people round? Are there ways of positioning the footage that would lead people to look in that sort of direction? And so a whole lot of questions about the freedom of interactivity and the direction that you really want to take people in came up. This is a bit of sort of some idea. You don't get it because obviously it's 2D here, of this kind of footage, and this is just moving around on the sort of web page. So you could look wherever you like, but there's a certain ideal passage through this film that we as filmmakers have sort of decided, but you may not look there. This is a classic example. We want you to watch this horse, but this person is going to go right and look round, and you'll spot me trying to hide from the camera by somewhere else. We don't want you to look there. So, but the thing that made it a documentary film, to my mind, and not just 360-degree footage, was this guy, Jason Hart, and this is why it's called The Circuit. He's a jockey. There's only 400 registered jockeys in the UK, but at any one moment there's 20,000 racehorses on the circuit. So most jockeys, when they get onto their horse, have never been on the horse before in their life. They're quite often riding 9 horses in one day. Sometimes they're going to 3 meetings. And so this was the research side of it in classic documentary sense. We thought, okay, wouldn't it be interesting to have his perspective of what it's like to run one race? So as you watch our 360 footage, you've got Jason in your head, from the weigh-in room to the winner's enclosure, explain to you what he's thinking at each stage. So for the punters, for the crowd that are there, it might be the biggest day in their life, but for Jason it's just another horse, another job that he's got to adapt to in split seconds. He's got to ask another jockey if anyone's ever ridden the horse. He's got to ask the trainer what it's like. He's got to ask the owner for some tips. And then he gets on the horse and he has maybe a couple of minutes to feel out the horse and adapt and use his intuition, and then he's off. So our film's called The Circuit, and it's that experience. It premiered at the Glasgow Film Festival just about a month or so ago as part of the VR cinema. Now, a VR cinema sounds, well, it's deceptive really, isn't it? Because a VR cinema isn't really like a cinema at all. A VR cinema means about sort of 15 seats with headsets in which you watch VR films. And we were part of that program, a very nice program, a beautifully curated program that had a VR interface. Of this was the cinema. When you're in the headset, you could choose which screen to go into, and you'd have the different films. So some artists called the Dennis and Debbie Club created that. But it does raise this sort of tension, which Cahill mentioned sort of earlier as well, and takes me back to the initial project of Northern Lights, of the experience. Whilst you might have a large degree of interactivity within sort of VR, you also have potentially a sort of sense of isolation, and you've lost some of that communal experience. And so this is where we're at in terms of that question of interactivity now. I'm not going to show you this clip, actually. And it's the question of how do you bridge those two things? And it takes me back to the Northern Lights project and the workshops. And so we decided to do a new project with a community of elderly and disabled people who are in Paisley, another one of our campuses. And we're looking at how VR works for them. But we're co-creating and co-producing with them. We give them an experience of VR so they get a certain level of digital literacy of what can be done in VR. And then we work with them to decide what sort of experiences they would like to have. And then we'll create the next project out of that. So we have a sort of, we have a raison d'etre, we kind of think, because we can give them certain experiences that they otherwise can't get for usually mobility issues and various kinds of things. But we also don't impose completely as directors, so we're opening up that participatory aspect of the project. I just sort of helped them make a wee video to raise some money for this, so I'll show you this and it'll just give you some idea of where they sit with it. This may or may not work in terms of the audio.